So good afternoon, everybody. We are really glad to have you with us today. Really, of course, disappointed that we weren't be able to do this in person. Although, given the weather today, this might be a silver lining to this rainy day. Is that we were supposed to be out in a cemetery this afternoon, and it was pouring the rain here, and it's going to pour the rain tomorrow. So, at least you guys will get to do those visits virtually and not be drenched. So, our plan for this afternoon is we're going to do a couple things. One, we have a special guest speaker with us, Dr. Tiffany Momon, and I'm going to turn things over to her in just a moment. But then the other thing that we're going to be doing is an activity thinking about kind of some broad themes for Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And we'll do that as kind of a small group exercise in the last hour of our time together. The other thing that we'll do towards the end is just kind of review the syllabus and make sure everyone is clear on what we're going to be doing over the course of the next few weeks, because I know there's a lot of moving pieces, a lot of things that are kind of you can do on your own time, but I want to be clear that everyone is aware of what we want people to join and participate in live with us. And of course, give you guys a chance to ask questions. So what we're going to do, again, to get started here is I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. Momon. Dr. Momon is worked with us for a number of years. She actually got her PhD here at MTSU in the Public History program. And when we were putting together the agenda for this, she came to mind pretty early on as she's worked with us on a couple of other teacher workshops in the past. And in fact, took a group and did a tour at Knoxville College, a historic Black college and university that is in Knoxville in East Tennessee a few years ago. Dr. Momon has done a lot of work with HBCUs, thinking about material culture and how we can use that to tell the story of the students who attended those schools. And has also done a lot of work thinking about placemaking and how we document the stories of African-American communities throughout the Southeast. So she is currently a visiting professor at the University of the South Sewanee in Southeast Tennessee. But we are really fortunate to have her with us this afternoon. So I'm going to go ahead and turn things over to Dr. Momon.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. And I am going to share my screen now. And can everyone see my screen? Great, thank you. So good afternoon or evening, I suppose, depending on where you are. Thanks for joining me today. And I want to thank Kira and the TPS team for the invitation. And I want to thank everyone working behind the scenes today to make this talk happen. So when Kira approached me and asked me to discuss the Reconstruction to Jim Crow eras and the larger themes of those periods, I immediately thought, well, how do I want to approach this? I also thought for a second, am I the right person to give this talk? A few of my other thoughts, should I just talk about all of the laws passed by the federal, state and local governments? Should I talk about reactions among state governments? I thought about what people got wrong about Reconstruction and Jim Crow and what I would like people to know. And then I decided to lean into what I know and how I do my work and my research. And the way that I approach my work and research is through people. I love people-based primary source stories. I love place-based stories. Historian David Blight always says that, quote, history is people and everyday people matter. And that line of thinking informs my work. And so today I'm going to cover three themes of Reconstruction and the Jim Crow era that I often see in my own work. And those are African-American placemaking, education and labor, and commemoration and memory. And so today I want to start with this image. And I'd like us to just take a moment and think about what we're looking at here. So this is a photograph of Ronald Watkins taken July 6th, 2020, standing before the ashes of the circa 1920 Canaan School, a Rosenwald school for African-American children in Murray County, Tennessee. And I thought this was a good starting point for today's talk because as a preservationist and someone who studies African American landscapes and placemaking, this picture of this loss resonated with me in unexpected ways. Of the tragedy at this site, Mr. Watkins said, quote, "It is all over with now. It really is hurtful to see that it is gone." The Canaan School was an integral part of a much larger community in Murray County known as Canaan, named for the promised land of Canaan as found in the Bible. In the Bible, Canaan is the land known as God's gift, and it's also an appropriate name for the area given by the newly emancipated freedmen and women who settled here. The Canaan community dates to the end of the Civil War and tells the story of how the descendants of the many Maury County plantations that stood nearby built their own community institutions upon emancipation. In this image from Google Maps, you can see the landmarks of the community outlined in red, including the Canaan AME Church, the Canaan Church Cemetery flanking the sides of the church, and the Canaan School just a bit down the road. The land for the church was donated by a freedman in 1865, and for many years, the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian congregations used the same building. The burials in the cemetery date to the late 1880s. The Canaan community speaks directly to the practice of African American placemaking as defined by historian Angel David Neves. According to Neves, this community exemplifies, quote, African Americans' attempt to claim a space for themselves within the complex social, economic, and political fabric of the US dominant culture of the antebellum era to the present. And so, as you know, I titled this talk Reconstruction on the Southern Landscape. And what I meant by that was that I wanted to explore Reconstruction to Jim Crow by examining how it played out on the landscape and in the lives of average people. One of the things I hate about how I learned about Reconstruction in high school was that the narrative was dominated by the troubles of Andrew Johnson. And you got a quick mention of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then it was more or less taught that people came together and bonded over their sadness of Lincoln's death, and they forgot about the past, and they sort of moved on. But that never quite made sense, right? Because if people came together and they got along, how did we end up with Jim Crow? So just this overall false sense of progress, but the truth behind Reconstruction and Jim Crow shows us the fallacies of that argument. And so today, I hope that you'll join me on this journey as we explore Reconstruction on the Southern landscape through the eyes of the people that lived it. And before we jump fully into exploring the few things of Reconstruction that we will today, I want to share this chart. So this is a chart that I use with my undergraduate students to get them thinking like historians, which may also work in your classrooms. And the columns here include cause and effect, looking at what were the causes of past events, what were the effects, who or what made change happen, and who supported change, as well as change and continuity in the red column. What has changed? What has remained the same? Who has not benefited from this change and why? Turning points in the blue column. How did past decisions or actions affect our choices? How did decisions or actions narrow or eliminate choices for people? And I felt like that particular question directly connected to this theme of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. As well as using the past in purple there, how does the past help us make sense of the present, and what can we learn from the past? And today I really want to focus on the orange column there, through their eyes. How did people in the past view their world? How did their worldview affect their choices and actions? And what values, skills, and forms of knowledge did people need to succeed? Creating ways for students to really, I use this column to create ways for students to really relate to the experiences of past people and past students like themselves. And so let's continue with the theme of African American placemaking. What we know about the South before and after the Civil War is that it is an agrarian society. Freedmen and women across the South will claim their freedom. Some of them took their freedom prior to the end of the Civil War, but given their experiences, what they knew was that they needed land and institutions. And among those institutions were churches, schools, cemeteries, and lodges that housed social clubs, which would become the pillars of Black communities. And I previously showed you the Canaan Cemetery in Murray County, Tennessee, and it is but one of many of these hamlets that pop up across the South that were great examples of African American placemaking. And so you have to understand that at the end of the Civil War, at the start of Reconstruction, and later the start of Jim Crow, that African Americans living in the South and throughout this country are living in a world that is not designed for them to succeed. Obstacles abound, yet the African American community perseveres. And one of the ways that they do this is by creating the institutions that they needed to support themselves. And so our next stop is on screen here, and this is Alexandria, Tennessee. And again, we have that same pattern of placemaking previously seen in the Canaan community of Murray County. And what makes this particular community so interesting, among a variety of reasons, is that so many of those community institutions, if you're looking at that Google Maps screenshot, are clustered right there next to each other. You have the church and the lodge, the school and the cemetery within walking distance. The school is no longer standing, and what remains of the lodge is just its stone foundation. What remains of the African American community of Alexandria acts as evidence confirming the memories of some of its residents. And that's what we're really talking about today, right? Seeing these periods of time through the eyes of the people that lived them, thinking about how they built these institutions and how they use these institutions. And on screen is an excerpt from Dr. W.E.B. Du Bois's 1903 book, The Souls of Black Folks. So while a student at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, Du Bois spent 2 summers teaching school in Alexandria and had fond memories of its residents and the landscape. And Du Bois wrote, quote, cuddled on the hill to the north was the village of the colored folks, who lived in 3 or 4 room unpainted cottages, some neat and homelike and some dirty. The dwellings were scattered rather aimlessly, but they centered about the twin temples of the hamlet, the Methodist and the Hardshell Baptist churches. These in turn leaned gingerly on a sad colored schoolhouse. For 2 summers, I lived in this little world. It was dull and humdrum. I have called my tiny community a world, and so its isolation made it. And this quote is from a chapter of The Souls of Black Folks titled, Of the Meaning of Progress. Which, what is progress during this era, right? Du Bois famously wrote in his book, Black Reconstruction, quote, the slave went free, stood for a brief moment in the sun, and then moved back towards slavery. And some of the voices that Du Bois includes for us in his examination of Alexandria, Tennessee, include Josie, a young African-American girl living on the family farm, the Dowell family, the Burke family, and others. And of his students, Du Bois wrote, quote, there they sat, nearly 30 of them, on rough benches, their faces shading from a pale cream to a dark brown, their little bare feet swinging, and their eyes full of expectation, with here and there a twinkle of mischief, and the hands grasping Webster's blue-back spelling book. I loved my school, and the fine faith the children had in the wisdom of their teacher was truly marvelous. We read and spelled together, wrote a little, picked flowers, sang, and listened to the stories of the world beyond the hill. But throughout the chapter, Du Bois inserts the voices of the people of Alexandria to tell the story of their lives. He recalls events that happened in these particular families, and one of those involves Doc Burke, the father of the Burke children in Du Bois's school. Du Bois recalled Doc Burke's ambitions as a farmer, noting that he was trying to buy the 75 acres of hill and dale where he lived, but people said that he would surely fail and that the white folks would get it all. Du Bois also told stories about Josie's family, noting how Josie's mother noted how she had bought a sewing machine, how she had worked at service in the winter, but that $4 a month was mighty little wages, how Josie had longed to go away to school, but that it looks like they could never get far enough ahead to let her. How the crops failed and the well was unfinished, and finally, how mean some of the white folks were. Du Bois later recalled how he returned to Alexandria some 10 years later and went to Josie's house and met her mother, who gave him an update on the past 10 years. And Du Bois wrote that, quote, Josie was dead. And the gray-haired mother said simply, quote, we had a heap of trouble since you've been away. Du Bois recalled his fears for Josie's brother and noted that, quote, with a cultured parentage and a social caste to uphold him, Jim might have made a venturesome merchant or a West Point cadet. But here he was, angry with life and reckless. And when Father Durham charged him with stealing wheat, the old man had to ride fast to escape the stones which Jim hurled at him. They told Jim to run away, but he would not run, and the constable came that afternoon, and it grieved Josie. Later on, Du Bois recalls how Jim was jailed in nearby Lebanon, Tennessee, and he begins to tell a bit more of Josie's story. And he talks about how Josie lived and labored in Nashville, Tennessee for a bit so she could raise funds for her family back in Alexandria. And essentially, Josie's mother noted that she essentially worked herself to the bone, right? And the mother said, quote, Josie shivered and worked on, with the vision of school days all fled, with a face wan and tired. Worked on until one summer's day, her lover married another, and then Josie crept to her mother like a hurt child and slept and sleeps. And he asks us at the end of that chapter, how shall man measure progress there where Josie lies? And he notes that he rode the train back to Nashville in the Jim Crow car. So here we've got an example of placemaking, but we also get a story of the Black lives and experiences in Alexandria as seen by Du Bois. And what he's challenging us to do here is to reconsider this progress narrative of these eras that he even back then recognized as false. And so while African Americans settled places, pooled their resources together to build communities, to build schools and churches and the like, they still could not escape the horror and anti-Blackness of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And in Josie's case, it basically killed her. And another thing that I would like to cover today is education and labor. And so we heard just a bit of Du Bois's recollections of education in rural Tennessee, but historian James Anderson in his seminal and prolific work, The Education of Blacks in the South, highlights several points for us. Anderson wrote that formerly enslaved people, quote, were the first among Native Southerners to depart from the planters' ideology of education and society, and to campaign for universal state-supported public education. Before Northern Benevolent Societies entered the South in 1862, before President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863, and before Congress created the Bureau of Refugees, Freedmen, and Abandoned Lands, also known as the Freedmen's Bureau, in 1865, slaves and free persons of color had already begun to make plans for the systematic instruction of their children. Early Black schools were established and supported largely through African Americans' own efforts, end quote. And so you see, it was feared by many elite Southern whites that universal public education, not just for Black children, but even for the children of poor Southern whites, would disrupt their so-called plans for society. Many of these folks did not believe that education needed to be state supported at all. And Anderson continues this argument by noting that, quote, during the period of 1860 to 1880, other classes of native white Southerners, including small farmers, industrialists, and laborers, showed little inclination to challenge the planters on these questions. Indeed, specific economic, political, social, and psychological relationships bound Southern whites in general to the ideological position of the planter regime. The result was that a post-war South was extremely hostile to the idea of universal public education, end quote. And so Anderson shows us that many Native Southern whites were essentially voting and participating in legislation that actually went against their own interest, right? And so, despite all of these hesitations about establishing schools for children, we saw through the Alexandria, Tennessee discussion that Black schools were created, and as well as separate schools for white children. But it is also during this Reconstruction period that colleges for Black students opened in the South. By the end of Reconstruction and the start of Jim Crow, one of these colleges that opened was Spelman College in Atlanta, Georgia, and it's pictured here on screen. And so I spent a great deal of time studying Spelman as a PhD student because I wrote my dissertation on it, but also because it challenged me, right? So what we know about early Black education is that many freedmen and women wanted schools for their children, but they had to find educators to teach at those schools. And so during Reconstruction, and even after the conclusion of Reconstruction, you had white Northern missionaries entering the South and starting schools for Black children. Organizations such as the Freedmen's Bureau started schools as well. So when I began my first deep dive into historically Black colleges and university education as a young Green Master student, I really didn't question the founding of these schools. It wasn't until I got deeper into the primary sources that I realized that, wait a minute, the founders of many of these schools, despite making schools for Black people, were deeply anti-Black. And so to me, that's another one of those myths of Reconstruction, that those who sought to aid African Americans during this period weren't white supremacists. We also have to remember that by the 1880s, the Black codes were in full effect, right? And so Black codes were strict local and state laws that detailed when, where, and how formerly enslaved people could work and for how much compensation, right? And so these codes appeared throughout the South as a legal way to put Black citizens into indentured servitude, essentially, to take away voting rights, to control where they lived and how they traveled, and to seize children for labor purposes. Remember that, seize children for labor purposes. So in the case of Spelman, it opened on April 11th, 1888, and was originally named the Atlanta Baptist Female Seminary. And by 1886, with the opening of the seminary's landmark Rockefeller Hall, which was pictured on the last slide, Spelman had grown to 6 times its original size. The school not only reflected the beliefs of its founder, Sophia Packard and Harriet Giles, pictured on screen, who were 2 Northern white women and members of the Baptist Church, but it also reflected their beliefs of white supremacy, paternalism, the tenets of segregation, and the promises of the so-called New South. And so the fact that African Americans, as we saw in the James Anderson example, as we saw in the Du Bois example, were busy educating themselves and establishing their own schools, that was not a fact that Northern Missionary Society members like Packard and Giles took into consideration as they advanced into Georgia and into the South. As historian Jacqueline Jones noted, quote, when white Northern missionaries began to work in Georgia, Northern teachers and superintendents had preconceived notions about the role freed people should play in the overall education effort. They believed that Black teachers lacked the formal training to be effective instructors, and that enlightened white men and women must assume major responsibility for establishing and, to a great extent, teaching in Black schools throughout the state. So when Packard and Giles arrived in Atlanta on April 1st, 1881, they entered a city that was still in the midst of redefining itself after its brutal fall during the Civil War. Packard and Giles simply ignored the reality that African American women in Atlanta, Georgia were outspoken advocates for their own well-being. In the summer of 1881, for example, African American laundresses in Atlanta organized themselves to form the trade organization known as the Washing Society. And you have a newspaper clipping there from the Atlanta Constitution on July 24th, 1881, that provides some details on the Atlanta washerwomen. And so the purpose of the Washing Society was to organize African American laundresses to demand higher pay, respect, and autonomy over their work, and to establish a uniform pay rate. Together, these women organized a mass meeting and called for a strike. On August 3rd, 1881, the Washing Society informed Atlanta Mayor Jim English, quote, "We, the members of our society, are determined to stand to our pledge and make extra charges for washing, and we have agreed and are willing to pay $25 or $50 for licenses as a protection so we can control the washing for the city. We can afford to pay these licenses, and we'll do it before we will be defeated. And then we will have full control of the city's washing at our own prices, as the city has control of our husbands' work at their prices. Don't forget this. We hope to hear from your council Tuesday morning. We mean business this week or no washing." I love that last statement. We mean business this week or no washing. So the city of Atlanta gave in to the demands of the Washing Society, and the Atlanta African American laborers gained some respect. The actions of the Washing Society in the summer of 1881 apparently did nothing to shake the falsehoods and stereotypical views of African American womanhood in Atlanta held by Sophia Packard and Harriet Giles, and they opened their school because they felt that they knew what was best for Black women and that Black women were not worthy advocates for their own well-being. By the fall of 1881, the city of Atlanta was preparing for the International Cotton Exposition scheduled to occur that October. The International Cotton Exposition was to be a World's Fair displayed through the lens of manufacturing cotton and dedicated to the emergence of the New South. Historian Tara Hunter astutely points out that the promise of the New South as displayed at the International Cotton Exposition was simply the Old South with a new name. Hunter notes that, quote, "African Americans in the New South would be closely defined by the Old South, in cotton fields or in servile labor in private homes, rather than in factory, managerial, or professional positions. Black workers would serve a visible and integral yet subservient role in the modern economy." And so this New South, complete with its racial baggage and white supremacist views, provided the prism through which Packard and Giles viewed to educate African American women. And many of those early Black schools focused on teaching children and adults trades. And it's not that trades are a bad thing to learn, but we have to begin questioning motives when trades are the only things that you want people to learn, right? They simply did not want children and adults to be educated out of their supposed status in life. And so in 1886, writing about Spelman's curriculum, Packard and Giles wrote, quote, "that industrial training is being introduced into the colored schools gradually year by year, and that is a cause for rejoicing. Every girl thoroughly trained in this department will be a missionary of wise management and practical knowledge in the domestic arts, a leavening power not only in towns and villages, but in the country where they have no knowledge of even the most common utensils in the household." And many administrators at these early schools felt the same way that Packard and Giles did. In 1907, Elizabeth Hobson, an administrator for the John F. Slater Fund, one of the largest funders of Black schools, wrote, quote, "The race question cannot be solved by industrial education, but industrial education will make the problem an easier one to deal with. And if solely for the sake of white people of the South, this work should be allowed to live and encouraged to grow," end quote. So the education of Black students in the South during this era is being tied directly to the feelings of some white people. So does that sound familiar to anyone, especially to educational debates currently happening? But what's really going on here, in the words of historian Hassan Kwame Jeffries, is that white Northerners end up propping up the views of white Southerners when it comes to labor and recreating the labor relations that existed during enslavement. And one of the ways that they do this, one of the ways among many ways that they do this, is through educational institutions with their grant money tied to teaching students nothing more than trades and domestic skills. I should have mentioned earlier that one of the stipulations for the previously mentioned John F. Slater Fund, if you wanted school money for your Black school, was that you had to teach industrial education. You had to teach the trades. And so there's a lot happening here. You have Southerners wanting to get back to their old labor economy. You have Southerners wanting to return Black folks to agriculture, but only if they can control and oversee it. And so from here, you get efforts designed to control Black labor. And one of those efforts is convict leasing. And so in Tracy City, Tennessee, about a 10-minute drive from Sewanee, where I work, are the remnants of the Lone Rock Stockade. And I was lucky enough to teach a linked course with Dr. Camille Westmont of Sewanee on the history of the Lone Rock Stockade. Dr. Westmont taught the historical archaeology side of the course, and I taught the public history side of the course. So it was interesting to blend those two viewpoints together. So the Lone Rock Stockade was a prison controlled by the Tennessee Coal and Iron Company, which used convict labor of a majority Black population, including men and boys, some as young as 14, and Black women, to work its mines between 1871 and 1896. And Dr. Westmont found in her research that following emancipation, there was a renewed drive and urgency to continue this convict leasing practice and to grow the practice, right? And so the effects of racially motivated legislation had already started to kick in. The overall prison population was growing fast after the Civil War. In 1860, less than 5% of inmates in the Tennessee prison system were Black. By 1866, that number had risen to 52%. And by 1896, it had risen to 75% due to convict leasing. And so what happens here at the Tennessee Coal and Iron site is that they start out with about 100 inmates in the early 1870s and eventually grow to about more than 500 by the 1890s. Upwards of 95% of the prisoners at the Lone Rock Stockade were Black, ranging in ages from 14 to 70. And Dr. Westmont found that, quote, the state of Tennessee was making unbelievable amounts of money off of the convicts. One lease could be worth over $100,000 per year to the state, or nearly $2.9 million today. So this was indeed big business. And so on screen is a newspaper advertisement from the Inter-Ocean newspaper in Chicago, Illinois, published on November 22nd, 1891. And so as I was preparing to teach this course, when I found this advertisement, my jaw completely dropped because it included the sketches and so many details about the stockade. It gave a complete account of the events at the stockade. And you can see the headlines over there to the left: misery of Tennessee's most favorite convicts, where shame and brutality stifle manhood, a savage system of labor. And so convict leasing was widely adopted across the American South to recreate that antebellum labor force. Through the use of Black codes that targeted Black men through racialized legislation, many of them ended up in convict leasing situations due to petty crimes like vagrancy or even being unemployed. Most of the convicts at the Lone Rock Stockade ended up there on these trumped up charges. Dr. Westmont often references one of the charges that she found looking at primary sources about inmates at the stockade, and she notes that she once found a convict there who was locked up in the stockade for the charge of stealing a wooden fence rail. So really the story here is that you didn't have to do much to end up in a convict stockade like this. And at this particular site, you can see the sketches here of the cells, the coke ovens. I'll jump back for just a second. Those I guess they're sort of half circle monuments there built into the landscape, are what remains of the coke ovens today. And they would burn coal in those and subtract the coke from them. And so here, at the stockade, it very much so was a prison, obviously. And one of the things that really stood out to me in doing this research about this site was really that brutality, right? So one of the stories that I found, and I think it's mentioned in this article here, talked about how it was so easy to get another convict if a convict were to die or attempt to escape. And it was so easy to get another convict that when convicts attempted to escape the stockade, staff were told, don't run after them, just shoot them, right? Just shoot them to kill them, because they were just that replaceable in this system. And so if we connect this back, the themes of education and labor, back to the practice of looking through their eyes as seen on the chart and listening to the people who lived this, here we got a combination of Spelman students as well as members of the Washing Society, as well as convicts at the Lone Rock Stockade. And something that I often thought about in doing my research, particularly on Spelman College, was that I wish that there were more primary sources that told the stories of the students there, but that told the stories that weren't sort of used as propaganda by the college's administrators and founders. So that we could really hear more about their experience and understand this experiences through their eyes. But here we do get the voices of the Atlanta washerwomen who organized for better wages and working conditions, their advocacy for themselves, fights against that Reconstruction and Jim Crow myth that white people knew what was best for Black people. And what really stands out about the washerwoman story is that African-American women during this period had so few labor opportunities, right? So they could find employment in white households as maids, cooks, servants, domestics. They could work as laundresses. Some found work as teachers, midwives, and nurses. But even those who still went to colleges, well-known established colleges such as Spelman, still could not escape the horror and anti-Blackness of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And so the last thing that I'm trying to stay on time here, I want to be cognizant of everyone's time, but the last thing that I want to talk about today is commemoration and memory. And I often think about this because I'm often wondering why the Civil War has such a hold on American history and American memory, right? So Kira mentioned that I am a history professor at Sewanee, the University of the South, and I often tell people that if any place has an obsession with the Civil War and the lost cause, it is most definitely Sewanee, right? And so that institution has a long history of really embedding itself in the lost cause, connecting itself to the lost cause. In the university's charter, there's a statement about how the university is founded in the land of the son and the slave, right? So there's a whole lot to unpack there. And so Reconstruction in our history, of course, is almost like an ongoing debate or referendum on the meaning and legacies of slavery and the Civil War. And in that referendum, the truth lost out, right? So many of the debates that we're still having today have been a referendum on the meaning and memory of Reconstruction and the lasting legacies of Jim Crow. And so today, our country is involved in a debate over the physical legacy of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And here I'm thinking about monuments and memorials. And so if we listen closely, monuments and memorials often tell us more about their makers than the people and the events that they are attempting to commemorate. And so historian David Blight has broken down how we remember and commemorate this era into three categories. And he calls them reconciliationist memory, white supremacist memory, and emancipationist memory. And he notes that, quote, the reconciliationist vision of this war, somehow putting ourselves back together, is rooted right there in putting bodies back together and putting hundreds of thousands of bodies into the ground. And, quote, the white supremacist memory, which took many forms early on, including, of course, the terror and violence of the Klan and its many imitators in Reconstruction, and then locked arms eventually in the later 19th century and into the 20th century with reconciliationists of all kinds in our culture, and delivered the country a racially segregated memory, a racially segregated story of this experience, at least by 1900 and really even before, end quote. And he continues with his description of emancipationist memory, and noted that it is, quote, rooted in the politics of radical Reconstruction, also rooted in 3 constitutional amendments and conceptions of the war as a reinvention of the Republic and the liberation of Blacks to citizenship, Blacks and eventually others to constitutional equality. And Blight notes that the reconciliationist memory and the white supremacist memory attempt to destroy the emancipationist memory, right? And although it takes some hits in that battle, the emancipationist memory never truly dies because it's kept alive by many, including African Americans. But here's the thing, the Lost Cause claims that the cause of the Confederate States during the American Civil War was just, heroic, and also not centered on slavery, right? It seeks to present the story of the Civil War from the position of the Confederates in the best possible terms. Nobody did anything wrong, essentially. In the Lost Cause, everybody was right. But what it also did was to define the Confederacy for generations with no regard to the actual truth. It is a victory narrative for an event that had no victory. And so Blight continues and notes that, quote, in the broader national culture, that somehow in this war, in this Armageddon, in this bloodletting, everybody had been right and nobody had been wrong. You want to reconcile a country that's had a horrifying civil war. Well, how do you do it? And Blight continues, you start building thousands upon thousands of monuments. And so pictured on screen are 2 historical markers located in Memphis, Tennessee. The marker on the right was erected by the Tennessee Historical Commission in 1955 and stands in the rear parking lot of the historic Calvary Episcopal Church in downtown Memphis. And according to history professor Dr. Tim Hubner of Rhodes College there in Memphis, quote, the sign marking Forrest's home actually stood at the site of his antebellum slave mart, because the same sources reveal that the site of both his residence and his business, which were next to each other at 85 and 87 Adams Street respectively, but those who placed the original marker in 1955 knew what they were hiding. And if you look at that marker there, it says that Forrest was born in Middle Tennessee in 1821, spent his early life on a Mississippi plantation. He later moved to Memphis, where his business enterprises made him wealthy. And so it's like, what were his business enterprises and why are we not talking about those? And so later on, the green marker on the left, and I'm missing the year here in my notes, but I think it might have been about 2018, 2019, was placed by Dr. Hubner and written by him and his students with support from the National Park Service. And the interesting thing about these 2 markers is that they're essentially down the street from each other. One made in 1955 and the other more recently. So we have a marker that hides the truth and one that tells the complete truth, and that is supported by folks in the city of Memphis and the National Park Service. So it's interesting to see here how this played out, how these 2 markers with these different viewpoints of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and Civil War and Forrest play out here on the landscape. But when we're looking at these monuments and markers and statues, we must consider the time and the context, right? So in 1955, the first forest marker goes up, and that's just shortly after the 1954 passage of Brown versus Board of Education, which desegregates schools, right? The next one goes up. I believe I just saw someone in the chat that it said 2018. So this one goes up in 2018. In the summer of 2020, it was vandalized and destroyed. That green sign was knocked off of its metal pole. And what's happening during the summer of 2020 in the United States? We have the murder of George Floyd. We have the Black Lives Matter movement going on in full effect. And the sign gets vandalized. And I believe Kira says it's also been stolen at some point. So that, if that sort of tells you where we are in this battle for truth and memory when it comes to Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And so beyond just statues and markers and monuments, the mythology of Reconstruction and Jim Crow has caused us as a country great harm, right? We're still fighting these same arguments over Reconstruction all of these years later. And I should note that there are many actors here involved in this myth making, including historians and scholars, historians of the Dunning School, which sought to redefine Reconstruction by essentially just completely lying about it. You have historical associations and societies and organizations like the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who wanted a statue of a Confederate soldier on every courthouse square, and who also influenced what went into school textbooks across the South. You have Northern educational missionaries. It even goes down to like state archivists, like Dunbar Rowland out of Mississippi, who when he was in charge of the Mississippi State Archives, refused to collect anything related to the Union Army, right? So Rowland wasn't even collecting things about Union Army vets in the state of Mississippi. To everyday people as being actors here as well. And so today I chose to just focus on these three themes, but there are so many themes of Reconstruction and Jim Crow to also consider, including violence and lynchings, Black codes, which I mentioned briefly, legislation on the federal, state, and local levels, and the list just goes on and on. But one of the legacies of this period will always be the people who fought back, who advocated for themselves, who pushed back against this myth making, right? And those are the people who we should focus on when discussing Reconstruction and Jim Crow. We should try to bring their viewpoints of the past, their voices of the past to the present through using things like primary sources. And we should look through their eyes, teach our students to look through their eyes, and maybe finally find a way to address the truths of the matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Tiffany. That was really great. So I want to give some time for questions. And I know we had one that was put in the chat box. You talked a little bit about labor and about a few of the jobs available for African-American females. And one of our teachers, Nicole, was asking, what were the options of employment open to white females to kind of compare the two?
Sure. So white females, and thinking about that, white females would have been able to take on, a variety of jobs. A lot of them took on work as teachers. You did have white women who worked as domestics or maids, depending upon where they lived, what their conditions were like where they lived. Many were homemakers. So there's a variety of things that they could do there. And there was a variety of things that they could do there. But in comparison, many went to college, but in comparison to Black women, you had this overall argument of you can only do these things, right? Instead of being able to branch out and do more.
Do we have any other questions? And feel free if you guys want to unmute yourself and ask. I mean, you are more than welcome to.
I have a quick question. So you at the beginning stated that you really enjoy doing place-based and people-based history. So where do you start with that? Like, how do you put the pieces together? Where do you, because I like doing the same thing, but it is a lot of work and it takes years to build over time, all these layers. But I was just curious how you tackle that.
So through a variety of ways, I sort of first left my previous career and went back to graduate school because I got an interest in genealogy. And so of course, genealogy is that, the history of people, who married who, where did they live, all of those, who were their children, all of those sorts of things. So genealogy is a great start, but with my current research, I actually spend a lot of time reading old newspapers. So my current research is based out of South Carolina. So I actually spend a lot of time reading like the South Carolina Gazette, because old newspapers back then were more or less the social media of today, right? You not only got like info on, the government, or, if a bad storm came through, you also got information on, oh, so-and-so is off in, this other place visiting family, and all of these sorts of other stories about about the comings and goings in town. And one of the things that I learned from my graduate school advisor, especially when it came to place and studying where you lived, was just to get out in the car and drive. And so I often find myself sort of going on these long drives, looking at things, and I'm a big believer that the more often you do it, the more often you learn to read the landscape, learn to look at buildings, you train your eye. So you quickly begin to pick up on, what you're seeing and all of that.
All right. Robert had a question. When you mentioned grant money being tied to curriculum, was that usually federal, state, or private grants, or some combination?
Some combinations. So the Slater Fund is one of those largest grant making organizations. And if you actually go out to like Google Books and type in Slater Fund, you can get an accounting of all of the ways, all of the HBCUs, as well as secondary and elementary schools that received that funding and what they received it for, which is really interesting. But you also had federal funding in the form of the establishment of land grant universities. And that money got sometimes it got kind of tricky, because what ends up happening in the state of Tennessee is the state of Tennessee basically designates Knoxville College as its Black land grant university, because part of the stipulation of, I believe it's the 1890 land grant law, was that you had to have a white land grant university and a Black land grant university. Well, at the time, Tennessee did not have a Black land grant university, so they turned to private HBCU Knoxville College, which was technically against the law, and gave Knoxville College the federal land grant money, as long as Knoxville College taught a specific type of curriculum. And that was one that was tied to industrial education and things like that. But you also had other big donors to HBCUs beyond the Slater Fund. Somebody mentioned Rockefeller in the chat. Absolutely. So Rockefeller essentially funds Spelman College, hence Rockefeller Hall on that campus. Spelman College has 5 or 6 buildings named after various members of the Rockefeller family. Their portraits are all over campus, et cetera, because they were the university's largest benefactors. And you could get money from Carnegie. A lot of HBCUs had Carnegie libraries, Carnegie educational buildings, et cetera, et cetera.
And I know early on, a lot of folks really liked your chart, your analysis chart, and ask if you can make that available.
Sure, I'll send you an email, Kira.
All right, perfect. All right, any other questions?
Yeah, just to jump on that Rockefeller and Carnegie comment, did they also put stipulations on their money as far as what the curriculum must be?
In the case of Spelman, Rockefeller did, right? So because the Rockefellers were their biggest donors. What they really stipulated was that essentially Spelman sort of keep doing what it was doing, which was following the curriculum as established by the college's founders, and things like that. Carnegie money gets tricky, right? So one of the ways that a lot of Black schools gain access to Carnegie money is actually through Booker T. Washington. And all of the work that he was doing at Tuskegee, as well as all of his sort of connections regarding funding schools, and things like that. That Carnegie money, I don't remember being tied to, what kind of education you taught. But there were instances where HBCUs would get turned down for that money. And there is an instance that I'm thinking of, and I believe it's with Wiley College and HBCU, and I hope I'm not misremembering that. But what happens in the situation of Wiley College is that they go back to Booker T. Washington and they say, hey, Carnegie denied us money for this library. And Washington essentially says, I'll help you out. And so he sort of plays middleman for them, and they eventually get that money for the Carnegie Library. So there's a lot when it comes to the funding of private HBCUs. There's a lot of complexities there, and there's actually a very great book about it. And I can't remember the title, but I'll take a quick second and look it up if you're interested in it.
Well, one quick question, follow-up question to that, if you don't mind, is when you're talking about Booker T. Washington and his relationship with Andrew Carnegie, since Booker T. Washington was heavy on vocational education and was feuding quite often with W.B. Du Bois, who was more into academic education, have you seen any connection to where Booker T. Washington would really funnel that money towards those that believed in teaching the way he was teaching and steering it away from more academia that W.B. Du Bois was focused on?
I can't think of any direct example where Washington is steering it away from a more liberal arts type of an education, but there are instances where he is steering it towards schools and universities that are interested in that industrial education. Absolutely.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, what we're going to do is take about a 5-minute break, just to give everybody a chance to get up and stretch your legs before we get into our activity. And again, I want to thank Dr. Momon again for her time today and for joining us. We really appreciate that.
Thanks,
So
everyone.
we will get started back at about 5:02, 5:03, or 6 for you guys that are in Eastern time. So take about 5 minutes. All right, so that is 5 minutes. If you guys will start making your way back. For the remainder of our time, we wanted to have a chance to think a little bit about both the readings that we did prior to today that many of you have commented on in the TPS Teacher Network, and we really wanted to thank you guys for your comments there. There was a lot of really great feedback and thoughtful responses. Before we kind of get you guys to reflect on those readings for just a second, I want to take just a minute to kind of explain why we chose those two particular readings. So in putting together the our syllabus for this series, we thought a lot about some of the different things that we've read and we've used over the years. And when we think about Reconstruction, Eric Foner is, of course, one of the preeminent voices in Reconstruction history. Stacy's holding up one of his giant Reconstruction books. And so you really can't talk about Reconstruction without using some of his work. And the essay that we chose for today, in particular, Why Reconstruction Matters, that was published in 2015, really kind of speaks to why it's important that we teach Reconstruction and that we are really thoughtful about why we do it and why it relates to understanding, again, kind of the course of U.S. history, really throughout the 20th century and into the 21st century. But, Foner doesn't get to where he's at and does the work he does if W.E.B. Du Bois doesn't write his book on Reconstruction. And really the work that he does in that book lays the foundation for so much of the Reconstruction historiography that is really relevant in today's history field. And so those two, and particularly the last chapter that we looked at today, we thought were good to start with, and just thinking about what it is that we want to keep in mind as we think about best practices for teaching Reconstruction and Jim Crow, because these are really complicated periods. And there's so much, misunderstanding and misinformation that's been out there really about these two periods. So before we kind of jump into our activity, I wanted to take just a moment. Oh, go ahead, Stacy.
Yeah, I just want to add something about Eric Foner, and that is that he would have been going through graduate school in the 1960s. And so that's a time when a lot of history was being rewritten to incorporate the stories of minority voices. And also he went to Columbia, and he's been at Columbia as a faculty member since 1982, which you'll remember Columbia was one of the institutions that produced the Dunning School that Du Bois is criticizing so heavily in his chapters. So if you're wondering what happened to the Columbia School, it is now the Foner School to maybe make up for some of that. But that's, yeah. So historiography has definitely changed through the decades, but public opinion always lags a bit behind scholarly trends.
So before we kind of jump into our activity, I wanted to give you guys a second to maybe share some things that really stood out to you in the readings, as we think about kind of best practices for teaching Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So if you want to unmute yourself and kind of add some thoughts, or if you want to drop them in the chat box. But again, what are some things that really stood out to you in the readings when we think about best practices?
This is Robert. For me, what really stood out as a teacher is correcting some of the fallacies that I myself was teaching. And that is about the federal troops protecting everybody in the South in all of these 5 military districts, as opposed to, as I learned in this reading, that the focus was on, I believe it was Louisiana and South Carolina, just those 2 state houses were being protected, as opposed to all of the South being protected. So it limited my focus on what federal troops in the South were actually doing and how they were being effective in protecting voting rights in the South. And it did, I guess it's better to know that, or understand that they weren't everywhere at every polling booth, making sure Blacks got a chance to vote. So it narrowed my focus on exactly what their efforts were in the South as federal troops.
That's a good point. Every state and every Confederate state re-entered the Union at slightly different times. I know in Tennessee, there's the, last out, first back. So the Constitution in 1870 is what removed federal troops from Tennessee at that time. But yeah, different states would have experienced that at different times. So yeah, it was never a uniform thing.
Anyone else want to share?
I'll share. I teach, hold on, my son is trying to make an appearance. Jacob, go eat. Something that kind of stood out to me with teaching, I teach AP US history. And so one thing that was mentioned was, it says books were written about Reconstruction to prove a thesis, not to seek truth. And like, that made me stop and think, because when I tell my students to write, like you read stuff, you make a claim, and then you support that claim, and historians are always right type thing. And so now I'm like, wait, like I need to be more intentional about the documents that they get, so that they're seeing truths from multiple time periods in order to make a claim, instead of giving them all one side. So.
It's a really good point.
Yeah, I'm doing the same thing with my students at MTSU. Even they're still trying to wrap their minds around that. And basically I just ask them, why are we still writing history? And why are every history book, why is every history book different? It must be because they're taking different paths to different conclusions. So why?
So what we're going to do with our activity is I want us to think about some of the key themes. So of course, Dr. Momon mentioned some key themes that she thought about in preparing her talk today. We've seen some other themes pop up in both the Foner essay and the Foner book, as well as in the Du Bois chapter. So thinking about, again, some of these key themes, and then we're also, once we've identified those themes, we're gonna put you guys into groups, and we're gonna think about some investigative questions that we might use to kind of address those themes. And then we're gonna spend some time maybe picking out a few primary sources in our groups. So to address our themes, we're going to do a poll everywhere. Let's see here, let me move this out of the way. And I've got way too much going on my screen here. All right. So if you're not familiar with Poll Everywhere, you can use the respond here at the top. So either the website here, or if you want to text it. I will say when you're doing this, I want everyone to submit one response. And when you do, if you're using more than one word, do an underscore between the words, because otherwise it will separate them and kind of mess up the word cloud a little bit. So take just a moment again, key themes. I want everyone to think about one theme that you would want to address when understanding Reconstruction and Jim Crow. If you can't get in, drop it in the chat box there, and we will, one of us will submit it for you.
if you write a word that's already on the board, it'll make it bigger. So you don't have to pick something brand new if you were
Yeah.
already thinking of the same word.
All right. Anyone not have a chance to send theirs in?
I did it, but I don't see. Oh, I see it.
Okay.
It keeps moving.
All right, so of course, the biggest word that we see is community, and that is definitely an important one. I am going to try to get a screenshot of this and where I'll drop it in the Padlet. What we are going to do is allow you guys a chance to get into small groups. Let's see, wait, let me, where I can. We're going to put you guys into small groups and then give you a chance to really kind of discuss some of these themes. And of course, you can just use this as a starting point. This doesn't have to be the only themes that are addressed, but this gives you a kind of a starting point. We are also going to be posting our group responses on this Padlet, and we'll drop this into the chat box, the link for that. So if you want to go ahead and open this up, you can. There's the link to our Padlet. And again, oh wait, hold on. Do that again. There we go. Now everybody can see it. So you're going to be put into, we're going to just do 3 groups tonight instead of 4 since we're missing a couple people. And again, in your groups, you're going to discuss what are going to get some key themes that you think are important to address when teaching Reconstruction and Jim Crow. I want you guys to come up with an investigative question. And then using the resources over here in the left-hand column, want you to pick a few primary sources that maybe you could use to address your themes and investigative question. So you'll see there is the album that our graduate student October has been working on that goes along with the visual essays in the Forever Free book that you can access through the network. And then we have 3 different primary source sets that we have done over the years, one on Reconstruction, one on New South, and then one on Jim Crow in America. And this is just a sampling of sources kind of to help us keep things to a more kind of a limited basis instead of falling down rabbit holes looking for sources tonight for this exercise. All right, any questions? All right, let's see. Let me stop sharing so I can see if I can find my breakout room screen again. Maybe it went away. All right. So I'm going to open our breakout rooms and we'll take about 15 minutes in here. We will be out here in the main room. So if you guys have questions, feel free to send a message. It'll pop up to me and one of us can pop into the breakout rooms and assist you. All right. So we'll open the breakout rooms. All right, I'm going to move Joe to room 1. Okay. So I know you guys probably didn't have a chance to get through the totality of the discussion, but we're going to share what we have, and then kind of gives you guys again a starting point to think about, as we think towards the end of this cycle and thinking about what you guys might be creating with your partner. So I am going to bring up my screen so we're all looking at the same thing. And so what we're going to have you guys do in your groups, if someone wants to volunteer to be a spokesperson for the group, kind of run us through what you guys were able to come up with in your discussion regarding themes, and if you were able to get to the investigative question. So group one, would you like to share?
I'm going to let the historians in my group talk more than me.
So does one of Joe's group members here want to volunteer?
Sorry, I was talking a lot with my mic muted. So I was just going. I thought I was, enlightening all of you.
I figured you'd go. I was praying, please let him go.
So as I was saying, one of the things that we were looking at is, it started off with an investigative question that I had asked to the group, which was, what was the true intent of presidential reconstruction as applied by President Andrew Johnson versus those congressmen known as the radical Republicans intended? And so we got heavy into understanding that Reconstruction, or that the politicians themselves were going after certain groups of people. They knew who they wanted to target. And it wasn't necessarily a matter of black or white. It was a matter of rich or poor. It was a matter of talking about the fact that President Johnson was not a fan of the elite, that he was more a fan of the common white man and not a fan at all of the black man. So he was really trying to focus more on returning the South to the common white man and trying to push down the black voices, the black politicians. And we talked a lot about how the connotation that blacks were ignorant, that blacks were lazy, and that they shouldn't be in the state houses was totally contrary to the people that were actually elected to those state houses. The fact that you had African Americans with PhDs, you had highly educated college graduates, you had pastors of churches and so forth. And the fact that in the reading, you see that those Southern governments were actually pretty effective, that they had some major accomplishments like public education and so forth. And how that went back to the discussion from Dr. Momon, who talked about the fact that even the elite in the South, they really didn't even want the white children, the poor white children, to become educated, because really they wanted to focus on the people at their level and leaving them there, and how the poor white sharecropper was just barely a step above the poor black sharecropper. And so the emphasis was more on economics and who they wanted to prosper and who they really didn't want to prosper. I think that was a lot. Now you're muted.
Yeah, my turn. All right. So thank you for that. All right, so group two, we had a volunteer from there kind of share some things that you guys discussed.
I'll go. I'm not shy. Let's see. Okay, so we talked a lot about, well, first of all, we had to rush because we were so into the documents, but we really started to look at kind of the rise and fall of African Americans after the Civil War and how things were really, really good. And then things got really, really bad. And, kind of taking that. And then we found, so we kind of felt like we had to find a document first to really wrap our heads around before we could dig into a question or a theme. And so we ended up finding the source of the illustration depicting African American, the exodusters moving to Kansas. And so we took that into social and economic, because those two were so tied together at the time, and really thinking like, if everything was supposed to be so great in the South for African Americans during Reconstruction, then why are they leaving? And so you could really dig into at all levels. We have from 5th grade up to AP juniors. What is happening in the South that is so contrary to what we believe about Reconstruction, to make these people want to leave? So I think I got all that.
Thank you.
I'm going to add one quick thing. I don't know who mentioned it. It wasn't me, but someone mentioned you can also talk about the positives and the negatives at the same time. So I thought that was really cool. So whoever said that in our group, thank you.
That's a great point. All right, so group 3. Volunteer from group 3.
So we like Dr. Momon's place-based history. And so we were talking about finding local images in our areas of segregated schools for the students to look at. And we went with the question of separate but equal, and what does that mean? And found some pictures in the last source that you all provided on page 3 and page 10. And looking at what does that mean, and then tying that back, not just to the Jim Crow era, but who funded the schools, like Robert was asking earlier, and what were the stipulations tied to those funds for them to be able to build that school. So all about the educational aspect. Anybody else in the group want to add?
So education is a great lens to look through, and as someone who wrote their, I wrote my master's thesis on desegregation during the civil rights period, civil rights movement. Looking at this early period, there's so much that you can do, and it's the great thing about you. Every community has a story when it comes to their local education system, and so it's a great way to, again, bring that local piece in for your students. So again, thank you guys for your work on this. And I know we had a short period of time, so you didn't get a chance to kind of really dig in maybe as much as you would like to, but hopefully this gives you a chance to really start to think about maybe some themes that you would want to explore in your lesson plans later on. And also kind of give you a few things to think about as far as sources here as well. So I want to spend the last few minutes kind of looking at our plans going forward and giving you guys a chance to ask some questions, because we do have several moving pieces and some things that we're still pulling together for the remainder of our time for this fall. So let's see, I should pull up our syllabus here so we're all looking again at the same thing. So the next thing on our list are our virtual field trips. And what we are doing here is we are working with the MTSU Center for Educational Media to help us go out and actually record 2 of these. And so we will be posting video links for the Benevolent Cemetery and Cemetery Community here in Murfreesboro, and the Natchez Street Historic District in Franklin. The Natchez Street one, the one for Franklin, will be the first one that we have up, and we will probably have it posted probably in a little over a week. And as soon as that is posted, we will add a YouTube link here on this syllabus. And then the same thing, once we have the Benevolent Cemetery piece, we'll have it linked as well. It's probably going to be at least a couple of weeks on that one before it's done, because we were supposed to go out and film today, but the rain prevented us from getting out and filming at the cemetery today. So we're hoping to be able to get that in next week, and then we'll be able to get that turned around in a couple of weeks. So you guys, those will be posted there. So again, those will be videos that you watch on your own time. And then for Fisk University, we are going to have a presentation from some of their staff with the special collections and library there at Fisk. They have some wonderful resources, and just it's a great piece to really kind of dig into, the significance of both the university and again their collections. So that is going to be a Zoom session. We've got that scheduled for November the 18th at 4 p.m. Central. If you want to join in live and again listen to the presentations as it's happening, you are welcome to do that. I will put a Zoom link up here in the next week. And so that link will be on the syllabus. Again, if you want to participate live, you can do so, but we aren't requiring it. We'll do the recording, and that recording will be available if you want to watch it later on. But if you want to have a chance to ask questions of the presenters, that will be a chance to do that during the Zoom live session. Once you've had a chance to view all of those videos for the virtual field trip, we are asking that you post a brief reflection about the different field trips on a Flipgrid. And I've got the link here. This will be similar to what we did back in the spring with Bridget and with the Mars Hill sessions. So I want you to think about, as you're watching these, what kind of stands out to you about these sites, and think about how local stories help students to understand how Reconstruction and Jim Crow shaped their communities. So that will be a chance for all of those. Questions about the field trips? Okay, so our goal again is for you guys to be able to get through all of those by November the 26th and have a chance to view those prior to November the 29th. And that will be our next synchronous session where again, we want to have everyone participating with us live. And then again, that will be 2 hours, and we'll be, again, kind of going back to that theme of using place to examine Reconstruction and Jim Crow. And for that session, we will be joined by our director, Dr. Carol Van West, who will again talk to us a bit about, again, using place and again, thinking about how we identify some of these stories in the landscape. And then we will have a panel discussion with some of the folks who have been working on some of the sites related to our virtual field trip. So John Lodel, who will be the person you will see in the video with the Benevolent Cemetery and the cemetery community. Laura Holder, who is one of our staff members here and has been working on historic preservation sites in Franklin for a number of years. And then Dr. Crystal DeGregory, who has been working on she's a Fisk alumni, and then has also been working on the story and significance of Fisk University in her own research as well. So we'll have a panel with them, and again, give you guys a chance to ask questions about using place to tell these type of stories. And then we'll have some time for some small group reflections before we round out that session. And then on December the 8th, this will be another chance. This one is, again, it's an optional synchronous session. If you can join us live, we would love for you to do that. But if you can't, there will be a recording available for you. And our staff is going to go through and look at some of the different digital collections and resources available for Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So this will be looking at some of the things that we have that we've used and created on our website. We'll go through and look at some things that the Library of Congress has, and then we're going to pull in a few other digital collections that are out there that may be of interest to you guys as you're thinking about writing your lesson plans. So again, you can, if you want to join in and be able to ask questions, you're welcome to do that. And if you can't, then we will have a recording available, and we'll get that uploaded the next day on December the 9th, and you can watch the recording. Once you have had a chance to do that, we do want you to share up to 3 sources that you and your partner are considering using for your lesson plans, and you can post those on our network group on the TPS Teachers Network. And again, you'll see the link is there for that. And then as we get to kind of writing by January the 7th, so again, kind of giving you some time to get through the holidays, I want you to, with your partner, post a discussion on Flipgrid with your topic choice, at least 2 primary sources that you'll be using in your lesson plan, and some key teaching strategies that you kind of want to explore within that lesson plan. And then we ask that you have the final thing, your final lesson plan posted to the network by January the 28th. Once you have posted your lesson plan, that is when stipends for this round of the fellowship will be paid. You'll also note that there are some supplemental materials that are posted in the right-hand column. Again, these are just some extra things that we have noted that, will be helpful for you kind of get understanding the broader picture of Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So of course, there's several chapters from the Forever Free book that you guys got a while back. Then if you've not already got it, you should be receiving in the mail this book. So this is Miles to Go for Freedom. And this one is written more towards students and has got lots of primary source images specifically from the Library of Congress collections. And so we have noted some readings for it for next time as well. There's also a number of documentaries that Nashville Public Television did. We included the one A Time for Joining, which is about some fraternal organizations and their role in community building. But there's several others, and again, you can watch those online. And then we also have a lecture that is from one of our past workshops with Dr. Cynthia Fleming, who has since retired from the University of Tennessee. But she talks a lot about segregation and what it meant to live in a segregated society. It's a really great lecture. Again, it's a good supplemental resource if you would like to view it. That's available on YouTube as well. Questions?
For our lesson plans, is it pretty much the same as the earlier lesson plan that we turned in?
Yes, we'll be using the same format as we did for the previous one.
And you guys will send that to us, or is that on that syllabus?
Yes, we
Okay.
can resend it if you need it. Yes.
Yes, I would appreciate that.
Are we restricted in time period?
So we wanted to focus on something between Reconstruction and Jim Crow. So as long as you can connect it to that.
So would it be okay to say, as a result of Reconstruction and Jim Crow, this event occurred?
I
Well,
think
and
so,
it'll-
if I'm understanding what you're saying.
In a lot of the resources that we pulled together that we usually kind of categorize under these things, we usually stop around like 1930. Obviously Jim Crow continues after 1930, but that's something we're going to be hearing more about from South Carolina. So as long as it kind of can put front and center primary sources from those time periods, then you can definitely draw connections to things that happen outside those time periods too, I would think.
All right.
Yeah, if you, as you're working on your idea, if you're unsure if it kind of falls to that time, we are happy to brainstorm with you and kind of talk about your specific ideas.
All right. I have an event in mind, but it's neither South Carolina nor Tennessee. So
It doesn't have
we'll
to
see.
be
It doesn't have-
necessarily
okay.
the states. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah,
I'll reach out.
yeah. Feel free to. All right. Any other questions? Well, again, thank you guys so much for your time. It looks like we're going to finish about 3 minutes early. So you guys have a great evening. And again, we will be in touch and let us know if you've got questions. So bye guys.
Hey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.